This is Kamchatka, a peninsula stitched together by nearly 30 active volcanoes, patrolled by more brown bears than there are paved roads to escape them. And split down its spine by a mountain range still being built, one eruption at a time. Other nations anchor themselves to mountains, others bend to the sea. Kamchatka answers to neither. It answers to fire. Kamchatka juts off the edge of Siberia in Russia's far east, roughly 1,250 kilometers long, hanging between the Sea of Okhotsk and the open Pacific. It sits closer to Alaska than to Moscow, cut off from the Russian mainland by geography, and for most of the 20th century, cut off from the rest of the world entirely by policy. Its spine of volcanoes forms one of the most concentrated, most restless volcanic landscapes anywhere on Earth. Winters here are measured in meters, not inches, heavy enough to bury entire towns to the second story in snow, driven sideways by wind that can close roads for days at a stretch. Summers arrive briefly and green, thawing the tundra just long enough for salmon to crowd the rivers and bears to fatten before the snow returns. Between the two, there is very little in the way of a gentle season. By any reasonable measure, a place this violent, this remote, this indifferent to human comfort should be empty. And yet, on any given morning in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, someone is walking a dog past a smoking volcano on their way to buy bread, treating the extraordinary as background noise. What kind of life becomes possible once you stop expecting the ground to hold still? We're glad to have you along for this one. Before we head into the fire and the snow, tell us in the comments, how far away are you watching from tonight? And is there a place on the map that scares you a little just to look at? The regional capital, Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, was founded in 1740 by the Danish-born Russian explorer Vitus Bering, who named it after his two ships, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. It grew as a naval outpost on one of the finest natural harbors in the North Pacific, Avacha Bay, and for decades during the Soviet era, it was a closed military city, submarine bases hidden in its fjords, its very existence scrubbed from ordinary maps. Foreigners were forbidden to set foot on the peninsula until 1990. Kamchatka did not open to the outside world. The outside world was simply let in, late and all at once. Nothing frames the city like its volcanoes. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky sits in the shadow of three of them at once: Koryaksky, Avachinsky, and Kozelsky, a wall of white cones rising directly behind the rooftops, close enough that on clear days, a plume of steam from Avachinsky's crater seems to hang over the harbor like weather that belongs to no forecast. Locals call these three the home volcanoes. They are not backdrop, they are neighbors. That closure did more than keep Kamchatka off the map, it kept it largely unbuilt. While coastlines elsewhere in the Pacific filled with resorts and shipping infrastructure across the 20th century, Kamchatka's harbors stayed reserved for fishing fleets and naval vessels, its interior left to bears, reindeer, and a scattering of research stations. The peninsula's isolation was never a matter of choice for the people who lived there. It was policy, enforced by checkpoints and permits, and it shaped an entire regional identity around self-reliance. Even today, arriving by anything other than plane or ship means committing to distances measured in days, not hours, and locals speak of the mainland the way islanders speak of a separate country, close in language and history, distant in almost everything else. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky is not laid out on a grid. It is draped across hillsides that fall toward Avacha Bay, streets bending around slopes too steep to flatten. Soviet-era apartment blocks, painted in fading blues, mustards, and pale greens, climb the terraces in staggered rows. Their bright colors less a design flourish than a practical response to a landscape that spends nearly half the year buried in white. Color, here, is a way of finding your own building in a snowstorm. What the city lacks says as much as what it has. There are no international hotel chains, no franchise coffee shops lining the main avenue, no billboards competing for attention against the volcanoes. Traffic here is sparse enough that a bear sighting on the city's outer edge draws more local chatter than a fender bender downtown. The nearest McDonald's-style fast food footprint belongs almost entirely to homegrown cafes serving fish pies and instant noodles to fishermen coming off overnight shifts. The people who end up staying in Kamchatka tend to fall into a narrow set of types, descendants of Soviet-era naval and fishing families who never left, scientists drawn by one of the most active volcanic laboratories on the planet, and a smaller wave of guides, pilots, and outfitters who came for a season of bear viewing or heli-skiing and quietly never booked the flight home. It is not a place people drift into by accident. Between the isolation, the cost of living, and the sheer physical demands of the terrain, Kamchatka filters for a particular kind of resident, one who measures a good life not by convenience but by proximity to something enormous. Public space in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky reflects this same practicality. Courtyards between apartment blocks double as informal gathering spots, strung with laundry lines and worn footpaths rather than manicured landscaping, because ornamental upkeep matters less here than function that survives a hard winter. Building entrances face away from prevailing winds wherever the slope allows it. Stairwells are built wide enough to haul firewood or supplies through, and balconies often double as unofficial cold storage for a family's share of salted fish or preserved vegetables. Even the city's layout of markets and clinics clusters near bus routes rather than scenic viewpoints, a quiet acknowledgement that in a place this remote, daily logistics take precedence over appearances. Beauty here is incidental, provided free by the volcanoes, never something the town needs to manufacture for itself. Kamchatka is home to one of the densest populations of brown bears on Earth, an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 animals roaming a peninsula with barely a few hundred kilometers of paved road in total. In the region's famous South Kamchatka sanctuary rangers have documented multiple bears fishing the same short stretch of river within sight of one another, an unusual tolerance made possible by a salmon run so abundant that competition briefly becomes unnecessary. Coexistence here is not a slogan. It is a set of hard rules woven into daily life. Locals venturing beyond town carry bear bangers or firearms as a matter of course. Garbage is managed with near-obsessive discipline in bear country, and entire fishing operations schedule around bear feeding patterns rather than the other way around. At Krulskoye Lake, one of the world's most productive sockeye salmon spawning grounds, rangers escort visitors in tight groups, radios live, because the lake's shoreline hosts one of the highest concentrations of brown bears anywhere on the planet during peak salmon runs. The bears are the headline, but the ecosystem widens fast. Steller's sea eagles, among the heaviest eagles alive, nest along Kamchatka's coasts in numbers found almost nowhere else. Orcas and humpback whales work the offshore waters of Avacha Bay close enough to be seen from the city's own shoreline. Sea otters, once hunted to the edge of extinction along this coast, have rebuilt stable populations in the peninsula's sheltered bays. And each summer, Kamchatka's rivers carry one of the largest wild salmon runs left on Earth. Several species, sometimes overlapping in the same waters, in numbers that still stagger fisheries scientists who study them. Children in Kamchatka's outlying villages grow up with a working knowledge of bear behavior most adults elsewhere never acquire. Reading tracks, recognizing warning postures, understanding which berry patches to avoid in late summer when bears are feeding hardest before winter. Wildlife officers hold seasonal briefings in schools and workplaces alike, treating bear safety the way other regions treat fire drills. Beyond the charismatic species, the peninsula's tidal flats and river deltas support enormous flocks of migratory shorebirds each spring. And its coastal waters shelter one of the last strongholds of the endangered Steller sea lion, whose colonies haul out on isolated rock stacks that few outside researchers ever see in person. Living alongside this concentration of wildlife is less a curiosity for Kamchatka's residents than a daily negotiation, renewed with every season. The single most disorienting fact of life in Kamchatka is not the cold, and not the isolation. It is the ground itself. This is one of the most seismically and volcanically active regions on the planet, part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where minor earthquakes are frequent enough to barely register as conversation, and where several volcanoes are active on any given year. Living here means accepting, on some level, that the earth beneath your apartment is not a fixed and finished thing. The adaptation is partly practical and partly psychological. Buildings in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky are constructed to seismic codes that would seem excessive almost anywhere else. Residents keep a mental map of which volcano is currently active and which is dormant, tracking ashfall advisories the way other cities track pollen counts. Fishermen and pilots plan routes around eruption plumes that can ground flights or blanket roads in fine grey ash within hours. There is a particular, practiced calm that develops in people who have learned to read a mountain's mood the way others read the sky. What residents describe more often than fear is a strange intimacy with scale. Standing near an active crater, feeling heat rise through solid rock, produces a kind of humility that locals say resets something in a person, a reminder that human timelines are brief guests on a much older, much larger schedule. Between the volcanic seasons comes a shorter, gentler interval, a few weeks in early autumn When ash settles, rivers run high with the last of the salmon, and the tundra turns a deep rust red before the snow arrives. A quiet, in-between light that photographers and locals alike call the peninsula's best kept secret. This constant low hum of geological activity has produced its own household culture. Families keep eruption kits near the door alongside winter emergency supplies, masks, goggles, a spare set of clothes, treated with the same unremarkable practicality as a fire extinguisher. School drills cover ashfall procedure the same afternoon they cover earthquake protocol. Older residents talk about specific eruptions the way people elsewhere talk about hard winters or major storms, dating memories by which volcano was active at the time. And there is, undeniably, a pull to it. Visitors report a giddy disbelief standing near an open vent, but locals describe something closer to comfort, the sense of living somewhere that is still, visibly and audibly, becoming itself. Kamchatka's connection to the wider world runs largely through volcanology. The peninsula is one of the most closely studied volcanic regions on the planet, home to the Institute of Volcanology and Seismology in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, where scientists monitor an ever-shifting roster of active peaks and have done so since the Soviet era. Researchers here study eruption mechanics, gas emissions, and seismic precursors that inform hazard science used far beyond Russia's borders. The peninsula's most famous scientific event remains the 1975-76 eruption of Tolbachik, one of the largest basaltic fissure eruptions of the 20th century, which reshaped a stretch of the peninsula's interior and gave volcanologists a working, real-time model of how entire lava fields are born. Decades later, a second Tolbachik eruption in 2012 offered scientists a rare chance to study the same volcanic system twice in one lifetime. What does it mean to build a career studying a mountain that could, without much warning, rewrite the map beneath your feet? What does it teach a community to live permanently downhill from an open question? Kamchatka doesn't answer these questions so much as it holds them patiently at high altitude. Fire, studied. Fire, lived with. The Institute's reach extends well past academic circles. Its monitoring data feeds directly into international aviation safety systems, since ash plumes from Kamchatka's volcanoes can drift across some of the busiest trans-Pacific flight corridors on Earth, and a single unadvised eruption has the power to reroute air traffic thousands of kilometers away. Researchers rotate through remote monitoring stations for weeks at a stretch, hauling instruments up active slopes by helicopter or on foot, building a dataset that now stretches back generations. Graduate students from universities across Russia and occasionally abroad complete fieldwork here that would be logistically impossible almost anywhere else, drawn by a concentration of active volcanism found in only a handful of places worldwide. For a peninsula this remote, volcanology has become an unlikely export, Kamchatka's greatest hazard doubling as its most enduring contribution to global science. If Kamchatka has a single symbol, it is the Valley of Geysers, a narrow canyon in the peninsula's remote interior holding one of only a handful of major geyser fields on Earth, alongside Yellowstone and Iceland. Steam vents, boiling pools, and geysers erupting on their own private schedules crowd a valley barely a few kilometers long, accessible almost exclusively by helicopter. The valley exists here for the same reason the volcanoes do, It sits directly above a shallow magma chamber that superheats groundwater until it forces its way back to the surface. It was not discovered by outsiders until 1941, when a local researcher, Tatiana Ustinovava, followed the warm water of a tributary stream upriver and found a landscape that, by her own account, seemed to belong to another planet entirely. For a place first mapped by Europeans in the 1700s, a major geothermal wonder hiding in plain sight until the middle of the 20th century says something about how much of Kamchatka has simply never been looked at closely. In 2007, a massive mudslide buried roughly 2/3 of the valley's geysers in a single event, only for new thermal vents to begin opening within the debris field not long after, the ground finding new ways to vent the same pressure. Locals speak of the valley less as a tourist attraction than as proof of concept. Proof that the peninsula is not simply volcanic in geography, but volcanic in temperament, restless in a way that reshapes itself and keeps going. Access to the valley remains tightly controlled, folded into the Kronotsky Nature Reserve, one of the oldest and strictest protected areas in Russia, established originally to shield the region's sable population and now safeguarding an entire microclimate found nowhere else on the peninsula. The valley's geothermal warmth supports pockets of vegetation and wildlife that thrive nowhere else at this latitude, tiny green refuges ringed by boiling ground. Pilots who fly the route describe the final approach as the moment even seasoned Kamchatka guides go quiet, a canyon that seems to exhale visibly into the surrounding cold. For a symbol representing an entire peninsula, it is fitting that this one still guards its exact location behind a helicopter ride most residents themselves will make only once or twice in a lifetime. Long before Bering's ships reached Avacha Bay, Kamchatka was home to indigenous peoples whose presence predates Russian settlement by thousands of years. The Itelmen, the Koryak, and reindeer herding even communities among them, each adapted to a different corner of the peninsula's harsh geography. Russian colonization in the 18th century brought disease, conflict, and forced conversion that devastated these populations. Some Itelmen accounts describe communities reduced to a fraction of their pre-contact size within a few generations. Today, small indigenous communities persist in scattered settlements across the peninsula's north and interior, some accessible only by helicopter or winter road, holding on to reindeer herding, salmon fishing, and traditional ceremonies like the Itelmen Alkalalale Harvest Festival, revived after decades of Soviet suppression of indigenous cultural practice. The contrast is stark and largely unresolved. A peninsula marketed internationally through images of pristine volcanic wilderness, sitting atop a much older, harder history of communities who called this same wilderness home long before it needed a name for tourists. Language carries much of this history's weight. Itelmen, once spoken widely across the peninsula's western coast, now survives among only a small number of fluent elder speakers, and community-led efforts to document and teach it compete with the practical pull of Russian as the language of schooling, commerce, and daily administration. Koryak reindeer herders still move seasonally across the northern tundra with their herds, a rhythm of life largely unchanged in its basic structure for centuries. Even as snowmobiles have replaced some dog sleds and satellite phones now connect the most remote camps to the outside world. Cultural festivals like Alkalalale draw both indigenous families and curious outsiders, But organizers are candid that revival is not the same as restoration. A living culture, they say, adapts and changes. It does not simply pick up where suppression left off. You live within sight of volcanoes that could, without much warning, change your plans for the week. You accept a winter that can bury your front door in snow and a summer window barely long enough to fix what the winter broke. You plan your groceries around ferry schedules and your hikes around a mountain's current mood. And yet, the people who stay in Kamchatka rarely speak of hardship. They speak of scale, of what it does to a person to live permanently within view of something that dwarfs every human concern down to its proper size. Something slows down in people who live here. Time stops running on a calendar and starts running on eruptions, salmon runs, ashfall advisories, the particular red of the tundra in the short weeks before the snow. Perspective in Kamchatka is not a metaphor, it's the daily view out the window. The few 100,000 people who call this peninsula home, Soviet-era descendants, scientists, indigenous communities holding on to traditions older than the city itself, fishing crews who built the local economy from nothing, guides who never rebooked their flight out, prove something simple by their presence alone. That belonging isn't a matter of comfort, it's a matter of choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to stay somewhere that never once promised to make it easy. Somewhere in the valley of Geysers, steam is still rising from ground that has been venting the same pressure for longer than any city on the peninsula has existed. It found new vents once, after the ground gave way beneath it, and it will likely find them again. Kamchatka doesn't need to convince anyone to stay. The land remembers who chose it, and keeps venting, quietly, for exactly as long as they do.